The story of the greatest aerial rivalry in military history begins not in the smoke-filled skies over Britain, but in the quiet drawing offices of two nations preparing for a war everyone saw coming. During the early 1930s, both Germany and Britain recognized that the age of the biplane was ending. The next conflict would be decided by whoever could build the fastest, most lethal single-seat fighter the world had ever seen. In Southampton, a dying man was about to create his masterpiece. Reginald Joseph Mitchell, chief designer at Supermarine, had already built racing seaplanes that shattered world speed records. His S-6B had claimed the Schneider Trophy permanently for Britain in 1931, screaming across the Solent at over 340 miles per hour. But Mitchell was fighting tuberculosis, and he knew his time was limited. When the Air Ministry issued Specification F.7/30, calling for a new fighter, Mitchell's first attempt, the ungainly Type 224, failed miserably. It was too slow, too awkward, and Mitchell reportedly called it the sort of aeroplane I don't want to design. He started again from scratch. By 1934, Mitchell had begun work on what would become the Type 300. He demanded an enclosed cockpit when open cockpits were still standard. He insisted on retractable landing gear when most fighters still had fixed wheels. Most controversially, he designed an elliptical wing, extraordinarily difficult to manufacture, but offering the lowest possible drag for its lift capacity. The Air Ministry initially balked at the production complexity. Mitchell didn't care. He was building the finest fighter he could imagine, not the cheapest. Meanwhile, in Augsburg, Wilhelm Emil Messerschmitt faced different pressures entirely. The Bayerische Flugzeugwerke was nearly bankrupt when the Reich Air Ministry came calling in 1934. Messerschmitt had a reputation for building lightweight aircraft that prioritized speed above all else, including, critics said, pilot safety. His design philosophy was brutally simple: the smallest possible airframe wrapped around the most powerful available engine. Where Mitchell pursued aerodynamic elegance, Messerschmitt chased manufacturing efficiency. His Bf-109 prototype used a straight-edged wing that was far simpler to produce than Mitchell's elliptical design. The narrow-track undercarriage, which would later cause countless landing accidents, saved weight and simplified the wing structure. Every gram mattered to Messerschmitt. Every production hour mattered to a Germany rearming at frantic speed. The first Bf-109 prototype flew in September 1935, powered ironically by a British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine because suitable German power plants weren't yet available. 5 months later, in March 1936, the Spitfire prototype K-5054 lifted off from Eastleigh Aerodrome. Test pilot Joseph Mutt Summers reportedly climbed out after that first flight and said simply, "Don't touch anything." The aircraft was already nearly perfect. Both fighters entered squadron service in 1938, though Germany had the head start. Bf-109s saw combat in the Spanish Civil War, where Luftwaffe pilots refined tactics that would later devastate Poland and France. The Spitfire, by contrast, remained untested in battle. British pilots could only watch newsreels of German aircraft carving through Republican forces and wonder how their machine would compare. Reginald Mitchell never found out. He died of cancer in June 1937, aged just 42. He had witnessed only a single test flight of his creation. The inscription on his memorial near Southampton reads simply that he designed the Spitfire. It doesn't mention that he built Britain's salvation from a hospital bed, racing against his own mortality. By the summer of 1940, his aircraft and Messerschmitt's would finally meet in the skies over the English Channel, and everything both nations believed about air combat was about to be violently challenged. The Spitfire and Bf-109 emerged from fundamentally different engineering philosophies, and understanding these differences explains why their confrontations at 30,000 feet produced such unexpected results. On paper, both aircraft appeared remarkably similar. Single engine, single seat, low wing monoplanes with enclosed cockpits and retractable undercarriages. In practice, they were designed to fight entirely different wars. Mitchell's elliptical wing remains the Spitfire's most recognizable feature, but its purpose was purely functional. That distinctive curved shape produced the thinnest possible wing for its area, reducing drag while maintaining the structural strength needed for high-speed maneuvers. The wing's cross-section was based on the NACA 2200 series aerofoil, modified by Supermarine's aerodynamicist Beverly Shenstone to delay the onset of compressibility effects at high speeds. This meant the Spitfire could dive faster before encountering dangerous buffeting, a crucial advantage when chasing or escaping. The Bf-109's wing told a different story. Messerschmitt prioritized rapid production over aerodynamic perfection. His single-spar wing design used leading-edge slats that deployed automatically at low speeds, dramatically improving handling during landing and takeoff. These slats gave German pilots a significant advantage during slow-speed dogfighting. The aircraft would warn them of an approaching stall and then help prevent it. Spitfire pilots received no such assistance. When a Spitfire stalled, it stalled viciously, often flicking into a spin without warning. But the most consequential difference lay in the engine mountings. The Rolls-Royce Merlin powering early Spitfires used a float-type carburetor, a design inherited from earlier racing engines. Under normal flight conditions, this system worked flawlessly. However, when a Spitfire pilot pushed his stick forward to enter a dive, the sudden negative gravity caused fuel to flood away from the carburetor. The engine would cough, splutter, and momentarily lose power, precisely when the pilot needed maximum thrust to escape or pursue. The Daimler-Benz DB 601 engine, fitted to Bf-109E variants, suffered no such weakness. Its direct fuel injection system delivered petrol directly into the cylinders, regardless of aircraft attitude. A German pilot could bunt his aircraft into a negative G dive and maintain full power throughout. During the summer of 1940, this seemingly minor engineering choice cost RAF pilots their lives. A Spitfire on a Bf-109's tail could be escaped simply by pushing the nose down. The pursuer's engine would hesitate while the German pulled away. Flight Lieutenant Bob Stanford Tuck later described the frustration vividly. "You would have a perfect firing solution," he explained, "and then the moment you followed him down, your engine would cut out for those crucial seconds. By the time the Merlin caught up, the target was out of range. British engineers eventually solved the problem." Miss Beatrice Schilling, a Royal Aircraft Establishment scientist, designed a simple brass restrictor that prevented fuel starvation during negative G maneuvers. Pilots called it Miss Schilling's orifice, with characteristic RAF humour. It wasn't a complete solution. The Spitfire still couldn't sustain prolonged inverted flight, but it eliminated the worst engine cutting during combat dives. Armament philosophy also diverged sharply. Early Spitfires carried 8 Browning .303 machine guns, chosen because ammunition was plentiful and the guns reliable. The Bf-109E mounted 2 machine guns and 2 20mm cannon, providing far greater destructive power per hit. However, the cannon frequently jammed under high G loading, and their limited ammunition supply meant German pilots had to be selective with their shots. These weren't merely technical specifications, each represented national assumptions about how air combat would unfold. assumptions that would be tested mercilessly when the two machines finally met in sustained combat over Dunkirk. The beaches of Dunkirk burned under a cloudless May sky, and above them, Spitfire pilots discovered that everything they had trained for was wrong. Operation Dynamo commenced on 26th May 1940, tasking the Royal Air Force with protecting the evacuation fleet from Luftwaffe bombers. For the first time, Spitfires and Bf-109s would clash in large numbers, and the results shocked both sides. Fighter Command entered this battle with tactics developed during peacetime exercises. The standard RAF formation was the VIC, 3 aircraft flying in a tight V shape, with 4 VICs forming a 12-plane squadron. This looked splendid during air shows and allowed for impressive, synchronized maneuvers. In combat, it was nearly suicidal. Pilots spent so much concentration maintaining formation that they couldn't scan for enemies. The wingmen watched their leader rather than the sky. Bf-109s, hunting in loose pairs with each pilot covering his partner's blind spots, slaughtered these rigid formations. Squadron leader Alan Deere of 54. Squadron survived being shot down over Dunkirk and walked back through the evacuation chaos. His report was damning. The Germans weren't better pilots, he insisted, but they fought smarter. Their formations allowed mutual support while ours demanded we fly blind. The Luftwaffe had refined these tactics over Spain. The Rotte, a pair of fighters with a leader and wingman, formed the basic tactical unit. 2 Rotten combined into a swarm of 4 aircraft flying in a spread finger 4 formation. Each pilot could scan his sector of sky while trusting his comrades to watch the rest. When RAF squadrons bounced these formations, the Germans simply broke and reformed, their loose structure absorbing the attack without disintegrating. Yet Dunkirk also delivered uncomfortable surprises to the Luftwaffe. German pilots had grown accustomed to easy victories over obsolete Polish and French aircraft. The Spitfire was something entirely different. Major Werner Mulders, already Germany's leading ace, reported after his first Spitfire encounter that this aircraft was the first enemy fighter that genuinely worried him. In a turning fight, he warned, the Spitfire could stay with a Bf-109 and sometimes outmaneuver it. The combat statistics from Dunkirk remain disputed, but patterns emerged clearly. At lower altitudes, where most fighting occurred over the beaches, the Spitfire's superior turning circle gave British pilots genuine advantages. The Bf-109's higher wing loading meant it needed more space to turn, bleeding energy in sustained maneuvers. German pilots quickly learned to avoid prolonged circling engagements, instead using their excellent climb rate and dive acceleration to strike and escape. Pilot officer Robert Doe, later one of the highest scoring British aces, flew his first combat mission over Dunkirk on 30th May. He described the chaos vividly. Aircraft everywhere, impossible to track friend from foe, smoke columns rising from burning ships below. In 3 minutes of combat, he expended all his ammunition without confirming a single kill. Most Dunkirk encounters followed this pattern, brief, violent, and inconclusive. The RAF lost 106 aircraft during Operation Dynamo. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 132, though German records remain incomplete. Neither side had achieved dominance, but both had learned crucial lessons. British pilots recognized their tactics needed radical revision. German pilots understood that the coming battle over Britain would be far harder than their previous campaigns. Soldiers evacuating from the beaches cursed the RAF for its apparent absence, not realizing that Fighter Command was deliberately engaging inland to intercept raids before they reached the ships. This misunderstanding poisoned relations between the services for years. But those who fought above the clouds knew the truth. The Dunkirk air battles were the rehearsal, and the main performance was coming. The air at 30,000 feet is a hostile environment that transforms aircraft performance in ways most ground observers never consider. At that altitude, roughly 6 miles above sea level, atmospheric pressure drops to less than 1/3 of its sea level value. Temperatures plunge to minus 40 degrees Celsius or colder. The thin air contains so little oxygen that an unprotected human loses consciousness within minutes. And for piston engine fighters, this rarefied atmosphere presented both mortal danger and tactical opportunity. Aircraft engines breathe air just as humans do. A naturally aspirated engine producing 1,000 horsepower at sea level might generate barely 400 horsepower at 30,000 feet, simply because there's insufficient oxygen to burn the fuel efficiently. The solution, supercharging, compresses intake air to maintain power at altitude, but the engineering challenges multiply with every 1,000 feet gained. The Rolls-Royce Merlin fitted to early Spitfires used a single-speed supercharger optimized for medium altitudes around 16,000 feet. Above 20,000 feet, power dropped away progressively. The Daimler-Benz DB601 in the Bf-109 employed variable supercharger gearing, allowing German pilots to maintain better power output across a wider altitude band. This advantage was not theoretical. It determined who lived and who died during high-altitude interceptions. Climbing to 30,000 feet consumed time, fuel, and engine life. A Spitfire. Mark I required approximately 16 minutes to reach that altitude from a standing start, arriving with a warm engine and reduced combat endurance. The Bf-109 reached the same height, perhaps 2 minutes faster, not because of superior climb rate alone, but because its fuel injection eliminated the mixture adjustments that British pilots had to make continuously during ascent. The tactical implications were profound. German bombers crossing the Channel at 25,000 feet forced defending Spitfires to climb above them for attack advantage. Those crucial extra minutes of climbing gave Bf-109 escorts time to position themselves higher still, turning the British bounce into an ambush. Pilot officer Geoffrey Wellham of 92 Squadron described the sickening moment when his climbing squadron was caught from above, 109 seconds, screaming down with sun behind them, while Spitfires wallowed at reduced power, desperate to gain precious height. High-altitude combat also transformed aircraft handling. The thinner air reduced control surface effectiveness, making all maneuvers feel sluggish and delayed. A Spitfire that could snap into a tight turn at 10,000 feet became ponderous at 30,000. Stall speeds increased significantly. Margins for error shrank. Pilots accustomed to throwing their aircraft around at lower altitudes found themselves fighting both the enemy and their own aircraft. Yet the Spitfire possessed one crucial high-altitude advantage that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Mitchell's elliptical wing, designed to minimize induced drag, actually improved relative performance as air density decreased. The Bf-109's wing, with its automatic slats optimized for low-speed handling, offered less benefit in the thin upper atmosphere. During sustained high-altitude turning engagements, rare but not unknown, experienced Spitfire pilots found they could match or even outmaneuver their opponents. The critical altitude band between 25 and 32,000 feet became the war's most contested airspace by late summer 1940. Whoever controlled that height controlled the battle. German fighters that could position above raiding formations held the decisive advantage of diving attacks, converting altitude into speed and energy. British controllers, tracking raids on primitive radar, calculated desperately whether their squadrons could reach sufficient height before interception. This invisible struggle for vertical supremacy never appeared in newspaper headlines, yet it shaped every major engagement of the Battle of Britain and beyond. What the Luftwaffe never expected was how quickly the Royal Air Force would adapt. German pilots crossing the Channel in August 1940 carried the confidence of warriors who had crushed every opponent from Warsaw to Paris. They anticipated 6 weeks to achieve air superiority over southern England. Instead, they encountered an enemy that learned faster than any they had faced, adopting innovations that transformed novice pilots into lethal adversaries. The first critical adaptation was tactical. Squadron leader Adolf Sailor Mallan of 74 Squadron had observed German formations during the Dunkirk fighting and recognized their superiority. By July 1940, he was drilling his pilots in a modified finger four formation that abandoned the suicidal Vic. His Mallan's 10 Rules of Air Fighting circulated throughout fighter command, distilling combat wisdom into practical guidance. Rule 3 was characteristically blunt. Always keep your eye on your enemy. It sounds obvious until you remember that rigid formation flying had demanded pilots watch their leader instead. Mallan understood something that peacetime training had obscured. Individual aircraft performance mattered less than tactical positioning. A Spitfire catching a Bf-109 from behind with altitude advantage would win regardless of comparative specifications. His pilots learned to refuse combat on unfavorable terms, diving away to reposition rather than accepting a turning fight from disadvantage. The pair system revolutionized wingman doctrine. Rather than 3 aircraft attempting to fight as a unit, 2 pilots formed an inseparable team. The leader attacked while the wingman protected his tail. If the leader was engaged, the wingman became the attacker. This mutual support meant that bouncing a single aircraft now meant fighting 2. German pilots accustomed to picking off isolated targets found their attacks met with immediate counterfire. High-altitude tactics evolved specifically for the 30,000 feet environment. Squadron controllers learned to scramble fighters earlier, building the precious altitude advantage before interception. When radar showed incoming raids, Spitfire squadrons were vectored not towards the enemy, but towards the sun, climbing parallel to the raid track. The bounce, when it came, arrived from blinding light, with gravity adding speed. The deflection shooting revolution proved equally decisive. Most pilots entered combat expecting to shoot at targets directly ahead, as they had on training ranges. Reality proved brutally different. A fighter crossing your nose at 300 miles per hour required significant lead. Bullets had to arrive where the target would be, not where it was. The Luftwaffe had learned this over Spain. RAF pilots had to learn it over Kent. Gunnery instructors at operational training units revised their curricula desperately. The standard methods had assumed bomber targets flying predictable courses. Fighting agile single-engined opponents demanded entirely different skills. Pilots practiced tracking crossing targets until the mental calculations became instinctive. Film from gun cameras was analyzed obsessively, revealing how often even experienced pilots fired behind their targets. Physical conditioning received new emphasis. High-altitude combat imposed brutal physiological stresses. Pilots experienced blackouts during tight turns as blood drained from their brains. Those who remained conscious while opponents grayed out held fatal advantages. Flight surgeons discovered that tensing leg and abdominal muscles could maintain cerebral blood flow for precious extra seconds. This technique, primitive compared to modern anti-G suits, saved lives. perhaps most importantly, surviving pilots shared knowledge voraciously. Intelligence officers debriefed every engagement, compiling tactical assessments distributed throughout fighter command. Mistakes made over Dover were discussed at Scottish airfields within days. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, guarded successful tactics within individual units. This institutional learning multiplied British effectiveness far beyond what aircraft numbers alone would suggest. By early 1941, the air war had transformed into something neither side had anticipated. The daylight bombing campaign against Britain had failed. The Luftwaffe had shifted to night raids, and fighter command found itself transitioning from desperate defence to cautious offence. Into this changed battlefield arrived the Spitfire Mark V, an aircraft that would restore British confidence just as German engineers unveiled their own improvements. The Mark V emerged from urgent operational necessity rather than planned development. Rolls-Royce had produced the Merlin 45 engine, delivering nearly 1,400 horsepower compared to the original Merlin's 1,030. This 30% power increase demanded airframe modifications, strengthened engine mounts, redesigned cooling systems, and revised propeller reduction gearing. The resulting aircraft reached squadrons in February 1941 and immediately demonstrated superiority over the Bf-109 E variants that had fought the Battle of Britain. Climbing performance improved dramatically. The Mark V reached 20,000 feet in approximately 7 minutes, shaving nearly 2 minutes from earlier marks. At 30,000 feet, where battles increasingly occurred, the additional power translated into better sustained maneuvering. Pilots reported that the aircraft felt more responsive at extreme altitude, its controls crisper than the progressively mushy sensations they had accepted previously. Armament evolved alongside the airframe. The Mark V-B variant carried two 20mm Hispano cannon, supplemented by 4.303 Browning machine guns. This mixed battery offered the destructive punch previously exclusive to German fighters while retaining the machine gun's reliability and ammunition capacity. A 2-second burst from a Mark V-B delivered approximately 14 pounds of projectiles, sufficient to destroy any single-engined fighter with solid hits. The Luftwaffe responded with the Bf-109F, arguably the most refined variant of Messerschmitt's original design. German engineers had cleaned up the airframe, removing the wing struts and adding a rounded spinner that improved aerodynamics noticeably. The Friedrich, as pilots called it, was faster than the Emil and climbed better, narrowing the advantage the Mark V had briefly enjoyed. Combat over France during the summer of 1941 tested both aircraft mercilessly. Fighter command launched offensive sweeps, rhubarbs, and circuses, intended to draw the Luftwaffe into battle and attrit their fighter strength. These operations reversed the tactical situation from 1940. Now British pilots operated at extended range over hostile territory while German defenders enjoyed the advantages of fighting above friendly ground. The results proved sobering. During June 1941 alone, Fighter Command lost over 100 pilots killed or captured. German losses were considerably lighter. The Bf-109F was not responsible alone. Tactical circumstances favoured the defenders as they had favoured Britain the previous summer, but the new Friedrich demonstrated that German engineering had not stood still. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, leading the Tangmere wing during big wing sweeps over northern France, reported that the new German fighters were distinctly improved. The performance gap that Mark V pilots had enjoyed for barely 4 months had effectively closed. Bader's loss over France in August 1941, though resulting from collision rather than combat, underscored the dangers of these offensive operations. Yet the Mark V achieved something beyond raw performance figures. Its arrival demonstrated that British industry could improve existing designs rapidly while maintaining production volume. Factories that had built Mark Is and IIs transitioned to Mark V production without significant interruption. By contrast, each German improvement required extensive retooling and caused temporary production drops. This industrial resilience would prove as decisive as any technical advantage. The air war over Europe was becoming a contest of attrition, and the nation that could replace losses faster would ultimately prevail. The propaganda machines of both nations worked tirelessly throughout the war, transforming aerial combat into heroic narratives that bore little resemblance to statistical reality. British newspapers celebrated scores of German aircraft destroyed, while German broadcasts proclaimed the imminent collapse of fighter command. The actual numbers, painstakingly reconstructed by post-war researchers, reveal a far more complex and sobering picture. During the Battle of Britain's critical phase, July through October 1940, the Royal Air Force claimed 2,698 German aircraft destroyed. The Luftwaffe, examining its own records, acknowledged losing 1,887 aircraft to all causes including accidents. This discrepancy wasn't deliberate falsification, but reflected the genuine chaos of air combat. Multiple pilots firing at the same aircraft each claimed its destruction. Damaged aircraft that recovered were counted as kills. Smoke trails from jettisoned fuel were mistaken for fatal damage. German overclaiming proved equally dramatic. Luftwaffe intelligence repeatedly declared fighter command reduced to its last 50 Spitfires, while British factories continued producing nearly 500 fighters monthly. By September 1940, German pilots had claimed sufficient victories to have destroyed fighter command 3 times over. The continuing resistance they encountered should have revealed these estimates as fantasy, yet operational planning persisted in assuming imminent British collapse. The Spitfire versus Bf-109 contest specifically generated statistics that surprised both sides. Contrary to German assumptions of overwhelming superiority, combat exchange ratios hovered remarkably close to parity throughout 1940. For every Spitfire lost in fighter versus fighter combat, approximately 1.2 Bf-109s were destroyed. This marginal British advantage reflected tactical circumstances. Defending fighters engaging bombers could choose their moments, while escorts were constrained to protect their charges rather than aircraft superiority. Pilot survival rates told equally important stories. A Spitfire pilot shot down over southern England had reasonable prospects of parachuting to safety and returning to combat within days. A German pilot in identical circumstances became a prisoner for the war's duration. This asymmetry meant that even equal aircraft losses favoured Britain decisively. The Luftwaffe was losing irreplaceable experienced aviators, while the RAF recycled its veterans continuously. Combat analysis after the war revealed uncomfortable truths about individual engagements. The vast majority of aerial victories were achieved against opponents who never saw their attacker. The romantic image of swirling dogfights, while occasionally accurate, misrepresented typical combat. Successful pilots positioned themselves advantageously, fired brief accurate bursts, and disengaged before enemy wingmen could respond. Prolonged maneuvering fights were signs of failure rather than skill. Wing Commander James "Johnny" Johnson, who would become the highest scoring British ace against German aircraft, analysed his victories methodically. Of his 38 confirmed kills, the overwhelming majority resulted from bounce attacks where his target was unaware until bullets struck. The aircraft's comparative performance, he concluded, mattered far less than positioning, surprise, and accurate shooting. Casualty statistics from high-altitude combat proved particularly grim. Engagements above 25,000 feet produced higher fatality rates than lower-altitude fighting. Pilots wounded or rendered unconscious at those heights rarely recovered control before impact. Oxygen system failures caused deaths attributed to combat. Cold-related equipment malfunctions disabled pilots at critical moments. The official histories published after the war attempted balanced assessments, but national pride influenced interpretations for decades. Only with the opening of German archives and systematic cross-referencing of loss records did genuinely accurate pictures emerge. These revealed neither British invincibility nor German superiority, but rather two approximately matched forces whose outcomes depended on circumstances, tactics, and individual skill more than mechanical advantage. The duels between Spitfires and Bf-109s at 30,000 feet left legacies that extended far beyond the 1940s, shaping fighter aircraft design, combat doctrine, and aviation technology for generations. The lessons written in contrails and blood above the English Channel informed everything from Korean War jet tactics to modern beyond visual range engagements. The most immediate influence appeared in altitude capability requirements. Pre-war fighters had been designed primarily for medium altitude performance, reflecting assumptions about likely combat conditions. The desperate high-altitude battles over Britain demonstrated that whoever controlled the upper airspace controlled the engagement. Subsequent fighter specifications demanded service ceilings exceeding 40,000 feet. The Spitfire Mark VII, introduced in 1942, was specifically optimized for extreme altitude interception with extended wingtips and a pressurized cockpit. These features, revolutionary for their era, became standard expectations. Engine supercharging technology advanced dramatically under combat pressure. Two-stage, two-speed superchargers emerged from wartime development, allowing fighters to maintain sea-level power outputs at previously unimaginable altitudes. The Merlin 61, fitted to Spitfire Mark IXs from mid-1942, transformed high-altitude performance so comprehensively that pilots reported their aircraft felt reborn. This engine technology directly informed early jet power plant development, as engineers applied lessons from piston engine altitude compensation to nascent turbine designs. Pilot survivability received unprecedented attention following analysis of wartime losses. Pressurized cockpits moved from experimental luxury to operational necessity. G-suits, developed from those primitive tensing techniques fighter command surgeons had taught, became standard equipment. Ejection seats, whose absence had killed countless pilots unable to escape damaged aircraft at high speed, were fitted to every post-war fighter. Each innovation traced its urgency to lessons learned over Kent and the Channel. Tactical doctrine evolved perhaps most profoundly. The pair-based formation that replaced the Vic became universal among Western air forces. American pilots over Korea flew finger four formations directly descended from German swarm tactics that RAF pilots had adopted during the Battle of Britain. The mutual support principles refined over Dunkirk and Dover remained valid against MiG-15s and beyond. The surviving pilots themselves became invaluable repositories of knowledge. Men like Robert Stanford Tuck, Adolf Malin, and Douglas Bader, those who survived captivity, lectured at staff colleges and training establishments throughout the post-war years. Their experiences informed training curricula that would prepare pilots for conflicts they never foresaw. The Royal Air Force's Fighter Combat School at Leconfield explicitly taught techniques developed during Spitfire versus Bf-109 engagements. Both aircraft remained in production and service long after their famous confrontations ended. Spitfires fought in Malaya, Korea, and Arab-Israeli conflicts into the 1950s. Bf-109s, produced in Spain and Czechoslovakia after German surrender, equipped air forces across 3 continents. These extended service lives provided continued validation of original design decisions while exposing limitations that jet aircraft would eventually resolve. The human stories perhaps resonate most powerfully decades later. German and British pilots who had tried to kill each other met at reunions, discovering shared experiences that transcended national boundaries. Adolf Galland and Douglas Bader developed genuine friendship. Günther Rall and James Goodson collaborated on historical research. Their testimonies preserved details that official records never captured: the cold, the fear, the exhilaration, and the grief for fallen comrades. Today, flying examples of both aircraft still take to the skies at memorial events and air shows. The distinctive Merlin howl and the Daimler-Benz growl evoke emotions in audiences who never experienced the war. These sounds connect present generations to those young men who climbed towards 30,000 feet, never knowing whether they would return, fighting a battle that shaped the world they bequeathed to us.